Hi, I'm Steve. I'm your teacher for abnormal psychology. I want to start off this morning with something that's a little bit of an experiment for me. I want to try to add these talking head lectures, sort of brief overview of each chapter and different chapters. I don't know if I'll do in every chapter, but I thought I'd try it this morning at least with this chapter, the chapter about disorders that first show up in childhood, and tell you some things about those that I think are worth thinking about. First of all, there are very few disorders that are specifically childhood disorders. When I came into this field, one of the things I was taught was that kids don't get serious disorders. And that's not true. Um, you do occasionally find kids with schizophrenia and obsessive compulsive and some of the other what they consider really serious disorders. There's a lot of disorders, however, that show up for the first time when kids, and they may then continue through the child's lifetime, but you first see them when the kids are children. A number of disorders develop later in life, but some disorders tend to show up specifically in children. And that's where I want to focus this morning, are some of the disorders that tend to be more unique to kids. Um, I think of three kinds of disorders that show up in kids. First, there's what we call the neurodevelopmental disorders. These are disorders that really clearly have some sort of physiological base to them. It's really clear there's something wrong physically with this child. Some of these disorders the most obvious among them is intellectual disability. The kids who have something wrong that intellectually they just don't have it. Now, this has been called by a number of different things over the years. Back in the early 1900s, when they first started testing intelligence, they used words like imbecile and idiot and some words like that were legitimate psychological terms for describing folks of low intelligence. Now, those terms got turned into pejorative name calling, so they've got dropped and changed to something else. And we got really sophisticated in the 50s and 60s and called it mental retardation, which then became the new pejorative for being calling people a retard. So there's a continual kind of thing about this because people have some feelings about this disorder, obviously, and so it becomes the language tends to become more pejorative as it's used over time. But it seems most commonly this is physiologically based. There's something going on with the brain itself that causes the problem. Another one that comes up, and I will mention this some during this week, is learning disabilities. People with learning disabilities are not dumb generally. In fact, often they're smarter than the average person, but they have trouble making connections between things and learning some things. They can hear stuff, but it has trouble going from hearing to memory. Or they can see stuff, but as they see stuff, things get twisted in their head so that they see the word cat and they think tech, or you see the word dog and they see God. They flipped it around. Happens in language, happens in mathematics. It's a physiological thing as opposed to emotionally there's something wrong with them. There's a problem with ADHD is considered to be a neurodevelopmental disorder that kids having serious problems with either focus or energy, managing their energy levels. Those are considered physiological. Then there are disorders that show up in kids for the first time that I tend to think at least of as primarily social, not entirely, but very strongly social. A couple of those are conduct disorders or oppositional defiant disorder. It's not unusual to find kids in hospitals because they have oppositional defiant disorder, which means they'll fight with whoever comes up. You walk up to the kid and say, God, it's nice, it's a pretty day out today. And they'll say, no, it's not. You don't know what's wrong with today. And it's almost like they have to fight with authority. Now, my experience with that is if one can figure out how to not engage in the fight with them, these kids actually be pretty bright kids, and they can handle themselves fairly well. Much of the, as I've worked with a lot of these kids, my reaction is, having met the parents, I understand why they have oppositional defiant disorder. If I were those kids, I'd be acting out too. Their families really try and control them in ways that are really crazy making. Um, but it gets defined as the kid has a problem, or from my perspective, the family has a problem. Um, but the kid's still the one that gets hospitalized. Um, there's a third group of them, which I think of as the trauma-based ones. You subject enough kids to enough trauma, and it really impacts them in many different ways. This week we talk about the adverse childhood experiences study that comes up this week. The study basically said you'd look at experiences that are traumatic for kids, and the more serious traumatic experiences a child has, the greater the likelihood they're going to have a psychological disorder later, the greater the likelihood they are to have asthma or diabetes or many of the lifestyle diseases that we tend to think of that people have. You look at the people's background and they have what they call very high ACE scores. These people often have a lot of trauma in their childhood because trauma disrupts childhood development. And this is a key point in this thing is, I tend to come at this for this field very much from a developmental perspective. I think developmental psychology is fascinating as can be. I had to unlearn a fair amount of what I learned in developmental psychology because it was wrong. I was told a lot of things. As an undergraduate, I took every developmental psychology course that was available to me. And that ended, the last one ended talking about 22-year-olds with the sort of implication that no real development went on after you reached age 22. And I thought, God, is my life over when I'm 23? You know, is that what's going on? What we know now is adolescent development doesn't typically end until about age 25. The cerebral cortex does not reach sort of full development until you're about 25 years of age. And the cerebral cortex is the part that has a lot to do with judgment. And deciding, for instance, it may not be a good idea to have one more drink before I drive home. You know, so, the alcohol is impacting that also. But the ability to think about that is a part of your cerebral cortex, and that's not well developed until one's about 25. Now, there's differences in that, you know, some changes back and forth, but there's a piece that's worth thinking about. The other big disorder that I want to mention here is autism. The diagnosis of autism has just skyrocketed over the last couple decades. And there's a lot of questions about why, and there's a lot of controversy about whether vaccines are a part of that or not. And there's no evidence, by the way, that this is. And I've actually looked to try and see what they say about it. I don't know if I understand why. I think part of the reason we know why is because autism, we've come to recognize it more. And because autism is a sort of amorphous disorder. And let me share something with you here. Where's my screen share at? Yep, wrong one. There are like five different components to the autism diagnosis. There's a language component to it. There's a motor skills, your ability to write and do things like that. There's perception, about how you hear things, or the how things are perceived coming into oneself. There's an executive function component to it, and there's a sensory component to it. I mean, folks with autism are often highly sensitive to sounds. That the sound of, I don't know if you could hear that, but if you had autism, you'd hear it, because for some people at least. The thing is, these are five different components here, and what's important is how one scores in these five things can give you a very different picture for what somebody has. Over here, for instance, you have somebody who's high in decent motor skills, but really low in language and has some real strong perceptual issues, but has decent cognitive, executive function and decent sensory stuff. That would show up one way, as opposed to someone with this pattern who has really good language skills and strong executive function. That person would seem pretty normal in terms of they'll talk to you fairly normally, but their motor skills being low, as it shows here, and the sensory stuff being problematic and perception being problematic, what they have to say to you may not make a lot of sense, because they may be working with a very different world than you're working with. It's one thing somebody says is, if you've seen one person with autism, you've seen one person with autism. It's a somewhat amorphous diagnosis, but it's real. It used to be, again, historically here, autism was one of those disorders that this belief was you got it and that's it for life. There's no change there. Well, we've learned a lot of things since then. There's some data that says folks with autism have, in fact, matured to a place or developed to a place where they no longer meet the criteria for autism. That, going back to symptoms, symptoms are intensity and duration and frequency. Well, if you reduce the frequency and you reduce the intensity and you reduce the duration, you can get to a place where you fall beneath the criteria. It becomes sub-threshold. Is that a cure? Well, what happens then is you have somebody that, as I would grow up, you just say, "Oh, they're really odd," but they wouldn't be the diagnosis for autism again. So autism's a funny one. I'll say here's a social thing about autism. If you're a parent and you have a child is in school and you're watching your kid seriously struggle with school, has some real trouble in school, and they get evaluated and the thing comes back is, well, there might be a diagnosis of autism here. Think about how you think about this one. On the one hand, you got, there's all the stigma of having your child diagnosed with a disorder. On the other hand, that means the child qualifies for special education and may have access to some serious additional resources to help the kid work in school. As a parent, what do you care more about those two things? And the answer is, for most parents, give me the resource. Diagnose the kid wherever you want to. Give my kid the resources so my kid can succeed in school. And that's become something of an incentive, quite frankly, for parents to allow their kids to be diagnosed with autism. I'm not saying the kids don't actually have autism, but as special education money has become available for it, the number of autism diagnoses has gone up significantly. And part is because parents are going, well, there's a reason to get it. There's something. I gotta come back to it. If it's my kid, and it talks about having my kid succeed in school, am I willing to let my kid get diagnosed with autism? Absolutely. I don't like it, maybe, but I'm more than willing to let it happen. And that's become part of the reason why the autism diagnosis just exploded for a while, because there's good reason to do it. I want to just mention one other piece here, and then I'm going to quit. It's enough time for this. The other one that shows up often in late adolescence is schizophrenia. Typically shows up late in adolescence. Sometimes, it does happen that you find 5-year-olds that we could say, yes, this child probably meets the definition of schizophrenia. It's pretty rare. It doesn't happen very often. The much more common one is you get a kid who, as the kid goes through early adolescence, they kind of go in, he's a little odd, but, it's okay. Smart enough, reasonable enough. And then something happens typically in late adolescence. And who knows what it is. There's no good There's no good research that says, oh, this is the trigger that causes it. But sometime in late adolescence, some kids start to hearing voices for the first time or start having some serious issues that gets turned into a diagnosis of schizophrenia. Um, that is not unusual. The age range from about 19 to 23 is the first pop up of that diagnosis. I didn't include that here because it's a diagnosis that's big enough by itself, but it's another one that comes up as a childhood diagnosis. Last point to make in this one. One of the key issues about working with kids with disorders is kids don't have language for things. Kids don't know what normal is. A couple of you have mentioned some stuff in the earlier things about the impact of grief on people. Well, I'm 72 years old. If recently, in the last couple of years, I've had some friends die, or some family members die, and it's like, it's hard, and it's painful, it's difficult. But I also know it goes on for a certain period of time, and then it's possible for me to redo my life and get myself back and regain some stuff. Now, it may take a year or so, but it's like, hey, been there, done that. I know it's recoverable. If you're 9, you don't know that. And it's really hard to make sense of what just happened here. And because 9-year-olds or 8 and 9-year-olds also still have a fair amount of magical thinking. Did I do something that made mom die? Is it my fault? Because I was really angry with her. Maybe that's why mom died. Those are kind of the traumas that can hit kids when they're young. The other one that pops up a lot, will come up in here, is you got a parent who's an alcoholic. And so you get beaten or something on a regular basis, and you have no idea why. What you figure out eventually as a kid is when dad comes home singing, hide, because it's dangerous. But kids end up with some magical thoughts about what's happened to them, particularly when they have those sorts of traumas as kids. And those sorts of things stop some normal development that should go on. And that causes them trouble later in life. And we will come back to that, particularly when we start talking about the chapter talking about trauma. So that's my brief introduction this week. Just sort of thoughts about some stuff, lots of readings, but that's my introduction to disorders generally showing up in childhood. That's it.